The steady hum of conversation filled the bustling airport terminal as passengers shuffled through security, their rolling suitcases clicking against the tile floor. Patricia Lawson, a woman in her mid-50 seconds with neatly styled blonde hair and a designer handbag slung over her shoulder, walked briskly toward her gate. She hated airports, the noise, the people, the chaos of it all. For someone who meticulously controlled every detail of her life, the unpredictability of air travel was nothing short of a nightmare. Patricia was a woman of habit, and flying was never part of her routine unless absolutely necessary. This time, it was a family obligation that had forced her onto this flight, a cross-country trip to visit her son and his wife, who had just welcomed their first child. While she loved her son, she didn't particularly enjoy being around babies, especially for an extended visit. The thought of sleepless nights and the constant chatter of doting relatives already made her uneasy. As she approached the gate, Patricia scanned the waiting area, taking in the crowd with a sharp, appraising glance. There were families juggling young children, business travelers buried in their laptops, and an assortment of other passengers who looked far too comfortable settling into the cramped seats. Patricia sighed, checking her watch impatiently. The sooner she could get on the plane and into her assigned seat, the better. At the front of the boarding line, a cheerful flight attendant named Clara Simmons greeted passengers with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard. Your seat is just down the aisle to the left," she directed Patricia, who gave a tight nod before stepping onto the plane. The narrow aisle felt suffocating as Patricia made her way to her seat, 7 billions, an aisle seat near the front, exactly where she had requested. She preferred the front section for quicker boarding and deplaning, and she always chose an aisle seat to stretch her legs. Even though she wasn't particularly tall, the idea of being boxed in next to a stranger for several hours made her skin crawl. She slipped into her seat and sighed, setting her handbag on her lap. The boarding process continued as more passengers filled the plane, some squeezing past her to reach their assigned rows. The overhead bins filled up quickly, and Patricia found herself irritated by the disorganized nature of it all. People moved too slowly, bumping into one another, stalling in the aisle as they struggled to stow their bags. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath as a man took far too long to place his suitcase in the bin above her. She clutched her phone, flipping it to airplane mode, but a small part of her wondered if turning it off was truly necessary. Did those rules really matter? She doubted it. Meanwhile, near the back of the plane, Monica Reynolds, a composed and confident woman in her late 30s, walked down the aisle with purposeful steps. She was dressed in a fitted navy blazer and tailored pants, exuding professionalism with every movement. Monica had been traveling for work for years, but this flight felt particularly significant. She was en route to a high-stakes business meeting that had the potential to shape the future of her career. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of someone used to commanding a room. As a senior executive at a prestigious nonprofit, she was no stranger to negotiations, strategic planning, and high-pressure situations. But this meeting? This one mattered. If all went well, it could lead to a major funding deal that would expand the reach of her organization's programs, helping underserved communities gain access to education and resources they desperately needed. As Monica walked past the front rows, she briefly noticed Patricia's disapproving expression. The woman's body language screamed impatience, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes flicking around with mild disdain. But Monica barely registered it. She had far more pressing things on her mind than the mood of an irritated passenger. She continued toward her assigned seat, 18A, a window seat further back. The seat had been chosen carefully. She preferred to sit by the window, where she could work in peace without being jostled by passing carts or restless aisle passengers. The middle seat next to her was momentarily empty, giving the illusion of extra space, though she knew it would soon be occupied. Sliding into her seat, Monica placed her leather briefcase under the seat in front of her and smoothed the wrinkles from her blazer. She pulled out her phone, checking for any last-minute messages from her office before dutifully switching it to airplane mode. She took a deep breath, focusing on the notes she had prepared for the meeting. This flight was a mere stepping stone to something bigger, something meaningful. At the front of the plane, Patricia shifted in her seat, already feeling discomfort settle into her legs. She scanned the rows ahead, her eyes landing on an empty seat just a row in front of her. A fleeting thought crossed her mind, maybe she could move there. But before she could dwell on the idea, an elderly woman with a cane appeared, guided by a steward who helped her into the seat. Patricia huffed, her irritation growing. "Great," she mumbled. "So much for that idea." A flight attendant soon walked by, offering a friendly smile. "Miss Lawson, can I get you anything before we take off?" Patricia hesitated before asking, "Is there any chance there's a more comfortable seat available?" The flight attendant's expression remained professional, though there was a hint of apology in her eyes. "I'm afraid we're at full capacity today, but you're welcome to ask another passenger if they'd be open to switching with you." Patricia forced a polite smile, though inside she bristled at the suggestion. "I have to ask someone myself? That's ridiculous." She had flown enough times to know that flight attendants usually handled seat requests, and frankly, she believed the airline should cater to her without making her do the work. Still, if she wanted a better seat, she would have to find a willing passenger. With a sigh, she unbuckled her seatbelt, preparing to make her way down the aisle in search of someone who might be more accommodating. As she stood up, her eyes scanned the rows and then landed on Monica. From her vantage point, Monica's seat looked perfect. A spacious window seat, tucked away in a spot that seemed infinitely more comfortable than her own. The middle seat was unoccupied at the moment, making it appear even more inviting. With renewed determination, Patricia started down the aisle. If she played her cards right, maybe she could convince Monica to trade places. Patricia straightened her blouse, plastering a composed expression onto her face as she made her way down the narrow aisle. The airplane was filling up fast, and with each step, she became more certain of her plan. She would find a more suitable seat for herself. Her eyes remained locked on Monica Reynolds, the woman sitting comfortably by the window, flipping through a thick folder of documents. Unlike Patricia, who had been growing restless in her aisle seat, Monica seemed at ease, fully absorbed in whatever she was reading. Patricia stepped closer, clearing her throat lightly to announce her presence. She had already prepared her words, believing that if she framed the request correctly, Monica would see reason. "Excuse me," Patricia said, forcing a polite but expectant smile. Monica looked up, slightly surprised by the interruption. "Yes?" Monica's tone was neutral, but there was a clear air of professionalism in the way she carried herself, as if she were already navigating a business negotiation. Patricia took this as an encouraging sign. Business-minded people were reasonable, she thought. Surely Monica would see the practical benefits of switching seats. "I was wondering if you'd mind trading seats with me. I'm up near the front in 7 billions. An aisle seat." Patricia gestured vaguely in the direction of her row, giving the impression that her seat was a better option. "I'd really appreciate it." Monica blinked, processing the request. She glanced briefly at the seat beside her and then back at Patricia. "I appreciate the offer, but I'd prefer to stay here," Monica said with a polite but firm smile. "I specifically chose a window seat because I need a quiet space to focus on some work." Patricia's smile tightened. That was not the response she had expected. She had anticipated a brief hesitation followed by agreement, not outright refusal. "Well," Patricia said, maintaining her polite facade, "I completely understand, but my seat is actually much closer to the front. You'd be able to exit faster when we land, and it's right near the aisle so you wouldn't have to climb over anyone." She leaned in slightly, as if confiding a secret. "Plus, I have some knee issues, and I'd really be more comfortable in a seat like yours." It wasn't exactly true. Her knees weren't particularly bothering her today, but Patricia figured a little embellishment wouldn't hurt. Monica, however, remained unmoved. "I'm sorry, but I'm comfortable where I am," she said simply. Patricia's stomach churned with frustration. Comfortable? Was that really the excuse this woman was using? Surely, it wouldn't be such an inconvenience to move just a few rows forward. Patricia had expected some resistance, but she had assumed that with enough persistence, Monica would yield. Forcing another smile, Patricia decided to try one last time. "You know," she said, her tone taking on a light, almost coaxing quality, "this flight is long, and I think you'd actually prefer my seat in the end. It's more accessible, and you won't have to wait for people to move when it's time to leave." Monica's expression didn't change. "I specifically booked a window seat so I could work without distractions," she repeated, this time with a slight edge to her voice. That was when Patricia felt something shift inside her, a flicker of irritation, a deep-seated resentment that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the refusal that stung, it was the way Monica said no so effortlessly, so unapologetically. Patricia wasn't used to hearing no. She glanced around, wondering if any of the other passengers had overheard the exchange. A few people were settling into their seats, their eyes on their own affairs, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Someone waiting to see what she would do next. She felt a slow burn rise in her chest. How dare she refuse? Patricia had asked nicely. She had given good reasons. She had been reasonable. And yet this woman, a stranger, had dismissed her without a second thought. A sharp response formed on her tongue, but she forced herself to bite it back. No, she wouldn't make a scene. Not yet. Instead, she exhaled sharply and muttered under her breath, "I can't believe this." Monica heard it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. She merely turned back to her folder, her posture straight and unaffected. Patricia, now fuming, turned sharply and stormed back toward her seat. As she sat down, she crossed her arms tightly, staring at the back of the seat in front of her. The flight attendants were making final announcements, but their voices barely registered in her mind. All she could think about was the insult, the sheer rudeness of being denied something so simple. Patricia convinced herself that Monica's refusal had nothing to do with the inconvenience of moving. It was something else. Something about the way she had spoken, the way she had dismissed Patricia's request so cleanly. She just wanted to make a point, Patricia thought bitterly. She just wanted to prove that she could say no, and what made it worse? Monica wasn't just anyone. She was a black woman who had challenged Patricia's authority, refused her without hesitation, and didn't even feel the need to apologize for it. Patricia clenched her jaw. She knew exactly what kind of person Monica was. She had seen it before, people who made things difficult just for the sake of it. People who acted as though the world owed them something. People who thought they deserved more just because they wanted it. Patricia's nails dug into her palm. Her frustration simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. She didn't want to let this go. Not yet. As the engines roared and the plane prepared for takeoff, Patricia sat stewing in her seat, her mind working feverishly. She didn't know how, but she was going to fix this situation. Monica Reynolds was going to regret saying no. Monica Reynolds adjusted her reading glasses and continued reviewing the notes in her folder, her pen gliding across the page as she underlined key points. She had a strategy to refine before landing, and she needed to be focused. But as she reread a crucial section, she felt a presence hovering beside her. She looked up. Standing in the aisle was the same woman from earlier, the one who had approached her with an unexpected seat swap request. Monica didn't even have time to sigh before the woman, Patricia Lawson, spoke again. "Listen," Patricia said, her voice tight but still laced with forced politeness. "I know you said you're comfortable here, but I just wanted to ask one more time. My seat up front is much more convenient, near the aisle, easier access to the exit. It really would be a great switch for both of us." Monica's lips pressed together as she carefully placed her pen down on the folder. So, she wasn't letting this go. She inhaled slowly, keeping her tone neutral. "I appreciate the offer, but I chose this seat specifically because I prefer the window," she said, keeping her response concise but clear. Patricia's forced smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I understand that," she said with a small laugh as though Monica was being unnecessarily rigid, "but my seat is right near the front. You'd be able to get off the plane faster, which I'm sure would be helpful." Monica resisted the urge to sigh. The assumption that she would be tempted by a better seat, simply because Patricia had decided it was better, rubbed her the wrong way. She knew exactly what she needed, and she had planned accordingly when she booked her flight. Why did some people think their preferences automatically mattered more than others? She maintained her composure and repeated her answer. "I appreciate that, but no thank you." This time, her words were a little firmer. Patricia's jaw clenched. "Well," she said after a pause, her voice a touch colder, "I just thought I'd ask since I'd be a lot more comfortable in your seat. You look like someone who understands the importance of comfort." Monica's brows lifted slightly at the remark. What exactly was Patricia implying? She let the words settle in the air before responding. "I do understand the importance of comfort," Monica said smoothly, "which is why I chose this seat. I hope you have a pleasant flight." It was a gentle but final dismissal. Patricia's nostrils flared ever so slightly as she hesitated, clearly debating whether to continue pushing. Monica held her gaze, unwavering. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then Patricia let out a sharp breath, forcing a tight smile onto her face. "Fine," she muttered, stepping back. Monica gave her a polite nod before returning her attention to her folder, dismissing the woman from her thoughts. Or at least, she tried to. Because as Patricia turned and stomped back toward the front of the plane, Monica could feel the tension in the air. The quiet resentment, the barely concealed frustration. She knew that look. She had seen it before. It was the same tight-lipped, forced composure that certain people wore when they weren't used to hearing the word no, especially from someone like her. The realization made Monica's shoulders tighten just a fraction. Still, she refused to let it get under her skin. She had work to focus on. And yet, from the corner of her eye, she could still sense Patricia sitting stiffly in her seat up front, her arms crossed tightly, her expression cold. And Monica had a distinct feeling that this was not over. Patricia sat rigidly in her seat, her arms crossed over her chest as she stared blankly at the tray table in front of her. Her irritation simmered beneath the surface, an unwelcome heat rising in her chest. She couldn't believe Monica had refused. It wasn't even a big ask, just a simple seat swap. People did it all the time. It was common courtesy. And yet, Monica had dismissed her request without so much as a second thought. as if Patricia's comfort didn't matter at all. Patricia clenched her jaw, shifting in her seat. She could still feel Monica's unwavering expression in her mind, calm, collected, and utterly indifferent to Patricia's request. No one had ever refused her so easily before. She exhaled sharply, reaching for the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket. Flipping through the pages absently, she realized she wasn't taking in a single word. Her focus kept snapping back to Monica. It wasn't just about the seat anymore, it was the principle of it. Patricia had asked nicely, multiple times, and had been met with nothing but rejection. And for what? Just because Monica liked the window? Because she wanted to be left alone? That was hardly a reason to deny someone else's comfort, especially when Patricia had offered a perfectly reasonable alternative. Her frustration mounted with every passing second. No, she wouldn't let this go just yet. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, glancing toward the back of the plane. A few flight attendants moved through the aisle, helping passengers settle in. Conversations hummed around her, a steady undercurrent of chatter and rustling luggage. Patricia straightened her blouse, smoothing the fabric with deliberate motions. Monica just needed a little more convincing. Maybe she hadn't explained her situation well enough. Maybe Monica had misunderstood. If Patricia framed it differently, surely Monica would reconsider. Squaring her shoulders, she started back down the aisle. As she neared row 18, she saw Monica sitting exactly as she had left her, calm, composed, and entirely unbothered. She was reading through a folder of documents, her focus seemingly impenetrable. Patricia set her expression to one of measured patience, determined to reason with her this time. Clearing her throat lightly, she stopped beside Monica's seat. Monica glanced up, eyebrows lifting slightly at Patricia's reappearance. "Yes?" Monica said, her tone polite but noticeably cooler this time. Patricia forced a smile. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she began, though she made no effort to hide the fact that she had every intention of pushing the issue further. Monica didn't respond right away, simply observing Patricia as she spoke. "I just wanted to say I totally get it. You like the window, and I understand that," Patricia continued, her voice softening, as if she were trying to reason with a child. "But I just thought that maybe you hadn't considered how much better my seat would actually be for you. It's near the front, so when we land, you'll get off quicker. You won't have to wait for people to stand up and gather their bags before you can leave." Monica set her pen down slowly, keeping her eyes locked on Patricia. "I did consider that," Monica said evenly, "and I still prefer this seat." Patricia's smile thinned. "But see," she pressed, tilting her head slightly, "I actually have some knee problems. Sitting in a spot like yours would help me stretch out more. That's why I was hoping you'd be willing to swap." This was a small exaggeration, but Patricia figured it would make her case more sympathetic. Monica's expression didn't change. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, "but unfortunately I'm still going to keep my seat." Patricia felt her patience beginning to fray. "Well," she said, her voice tightening, "I just thought you'd be more open to accommodating someone who genuinely needs it." For the first time, Monica's gaze sharpened slightly. "I booked this seat because I also have specific needs," she said, her voice remaining controlled. "I chose a window because I prefer having a space to work where I won't be disturbed. That's why I booked it in advance." Patricia blinked, taken aback by the firmness in Monica's tone. For a fleeting moment, something uncomfortable flickered in her mind, an awareness that she had pushed too far. But instead of backing down, her irritation deepened. Monica could have easily switched. It wasn't like Patricia had asked her to give up first class. It was just a seat change. But instead of being flexible, Monica had made it a point to refuse. Patricia's lips pursed, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "So, you're really not going to switch?" she asked, letting just a hint of disbelief creep into her voice. Monica met her gaze without hesitation. "No, I'm not," she said simply, a final answer. Patricia's jaw tensed. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at Monica as if expecting her to change her mind at the last second. But Monica had already turned back to her folder, unbothered, uninterested, and unmoved. Patricia felt heat crawl up her neck. Something about the way Monica dismissed her made her feel small, insignificant, like her needs weren't even worth considering. And that realization made Patricia's blood boil. Tamping down the sharp sting of rejection, she forced herself to exhale slowly, as if she weren't completely seething inside. "Fine," she muttered, her voice laced with thinly veiled resentment. She turned sharply on her heel and stalked back toward the front of the plane, each step heavier than the last. As she slid back into her original seat, she crossed her arms tightly, her nails digging into her sleeves. She could feel her frustration boiling beneath the surface, sitting in her chest like a weight she couldn't shake. This wasn't over. Monica might have said no, but Patricia wasn't done yet. Monica had made a mistake refusing her, and Patricia was going to make sure she regretted it. Patricia sat stiffly in her seat, staring straight ahead as the cabin hummed with quiet conversations and the occasional clatter of overhead bins being shut. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to remain composed. Her patience had officially run out. She had asked nicely, twice. She had been polite, even considerate. She had explained why the seat swap made sense, had given perfectly reasonable justifications. And yet, Monica Reynolds had shut her down as if she hadn't even taken a second to consider it. Patricia's chest tightened with irritation. It wasn't just the refusal, it was the way Monica had done it. Calm, unbothered, firm. There had been no hesitation in her voice, no guilt, no attempt to compromise. Just a clean, absolute no, and now Patricia could feel it festering inside her. She shifted in her seat, crossing her arms tightly. The more she thought about it, the more offended she became. What kind of person refused to accommodate someone else when it was such a simple thing to do? Monica had options. She could have easily moved to the front, taken Patricia's aisle seat, had a quick and easy exit after landing. But instead she had chosen to dig in her heels, as if it were some kind of power play. And the worst part? Monica didn't even care how she had made Patricia feel. Patricia could have let it go, could have moved on. But that wasn't how she was wired. Instead, resentment coiled tighter inside her, fueling a rising sense of self-righteous indignation. She wasn't wrong for asking. She wasn't wrong for expecting a little flexibility. If anything, it was Monica who was being difficult. She picked up the In-Flight magazine from the seat pocket and flipped through it without actually reading anything. Her thoughts raced. What if Monica had refused just to be difficult? What if this wasn't about comfort at all, but about control? Patricia had seen this before, people who took pleasure in standing their ground, refusing just to prove a point. Her fingers tightened on the magazine, crinkling the glossy pages. She exhaled sharply and threw it back into the seat pocket. She wasn't going to just sit here and let Monica think she had won. Her eyes flicked toward the back of the plane. Monica was still there, still calmly flipping through her documents, still completely unaffected by the exchange. It infuriated Patricia. How could she just sit there like nothing had happened? Did she not realize how rude she had been? Or worse, did she realize and not care? Patricia's jaw clenched. She hated being dismissed. She hated being ignored. And more than anything, she hated feeling powerless. A flicker of an idea formed in her mind. She glanced around the cabin, at the flight attendants moving up and down the aisle, at the passengers settling into their seats, adjusting their seatbelts, chatting quietly with their seatmates. Maybe it was time to escalate this. Monica might have thought she could just say no and be done with it, but Patricia had been on enough flights to know that there were other ways to get what she wanted. She just had to be smart about it. Her gaze flicked toward the nearest flight attendant, a young woman in a crisp uniform who was checking the overhead bins. Patricia straightened slightly, adjusting her expression to one of mild concern. She waited for the perfect moment, then raised a hand to get the attendant's attention. The woman approached with a friendly smile. "Yes, ma'am? Is there something I can help you with?" Patricia let out a small sigh, tilting her head slightly, as if considering her words carefully. "Well," she said, keeping her voice light but just hinted with frustration, "I was wondering if there were any other available seats toward the front of the plane. I originally requested something with more space for my knees, but I ended up in a bit of a tight spot." The flight attendant gave her a sympathetic look. "Unfortunately, we're at full capacity today, but I'd be happy to check if anyone might be willing to switch." Patricia nodded, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "Oh, I actually did ask a passenger if they'd be willing to swap, but she, wasn't very receptive," Patricia said, lowering her voice just enough to sound vaguely put off, as if she had been treated unfairly. The flight attendant frowned slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." Patricia sighed again, making sure to sound just the right amount of inconvenienced. "I understand, of course," she said, waving a hand as if she were far too gracious to make a scene. "I just thought, given the circumstances, she might have been a little more accommodating." She let the words hang in the air, waiting for the flight attendant to take the bait. Sure enough, the woman's brow furrowed slightly. "Would you like me to speak to the passenger?" the flight attendant offered. "I can always check if she might reconsider." Patricia pretended to hesitate, as if the idea had never crossed her mind. "Oh, I wouldn't want to cause any trouble," she said, shaking her head slightly. Then, after a perfectly timed pause, she added, "But if you think it might help." The flight attendant gave her a reassuring smile. "No harm in asking," she said. And with that, she turned and made her way toward row 18. Patricia sat back, folding her hands neatly in her lap, watching with quiet satisfaction as the flight attendant approached Monica's seat. Let's see her say no to this. Patricia sat back in her seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching as the flight attendant made her way down the aisle toward Monica Reynolds. There was a sharp, simmering sense of satisfaction curling in her chest. This wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about principle, about courtesy, about people knowing their place. She had given Monica multiple chances to do the right thing, to be reasonable, to be accommodating, and yet she had refused every single time. Patricia's fingers tightened against her sleeves. Who did Monica think she was? She had brushed Patricia off like her request had been inconsequential, like Patricia's comfort didn't matter. That alone was insulting enough. But now, the more Patricia thought about it, the more she started to see something deeper in Monica's behavior, something deliberate. Monica had refused because she wanted to assert herself, because she wanted power. Patricia's stomach twisted with resentment. She had seen this kind of thing before. People like Monica always had a chip on their shoulder, always looking for an opportunity to make a scene, to act like they were being mistreated, when in reality, they were the ones being difficult. Patricia's eyes flicked toward the back of the plane. Monica sat there, still perfectly calm, still flipping through her notes as if none of this mattered to her. That look of composure, it infuriated Patricia. It was arrogance, pure and simple. She had refused not because the request was inconvenient, but because she had wanted to. Because she had wanted to push back, to prove a point, to remind Patricia that she didn't have the power here. Patricia's jaw clenched. People like Monica, women like Monica, always acted like the world owed them something, like they were always the victims. And yet here she was, denying Patricia a simple courtesy without the slightest bit of guilt. The more Patricia thought about it, the more she felt certain that Monica had never even considered switching. She had decided from the moment Patricia opened her mouth that she was going to say no, just to put Patricia in her place. Patricia's grip tightened on her. Armrest. She had been polite, she had been reasonable, and yet somehow, she was still the one left feeling like she had done something wrong, like she was the one being unreasonable. That wasn't fair. That wasn't how things were supposed to work. Patricia exhaled sharply and glanced toward the aisle again, her eyes following the flight attendant as she approached row 18. This was Monica's chance, the last chance she was going to get. Let's see if she was still so defiant when someone official asked her to switch. The flight attendant leaned down slightly, speaking in a hushed voice so as not to disturb the other passengers. Monica looked up, eyebrows raising slightly in mild surprise, then nodded as she listened. From where she sat, Patricia couldn't hear what was being said, but she watched intently, her fingers tapping lightly against her knee. The flight attendant was gesturing lightly, explaining something. Monica nodded again, then spoke. Patricia could tell, even from a distance, that she wasn't agreeing. The flight attendant tilted her head slightly, clearly trying to persuade her. Patricia sat straighter, waiting for Monica to relent. But then, Monica shook her head. Patricia's stomach twisted. She was refusing again. Patricia inhaled sharply, her pulse spiking with a wave of frustration. Was she really that stubborn? The flight attendant nodded and straightened, offering a polite smile before turning back toward the front of the plane. Patricia felt her breath hitch as the woman walked toward her. When the attendant stopped beside her seat, Patricia expected her to say something along the lines of, "I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. She'll be moving shortly." Instead, she was met with an apologetic yet firm response. "I spoke to the passenger, but she prefers to stay in her assigned seat. Unfortunately, we can't require anyone to move unless there's a safety concern." Patricia's face tightened. She stared at the woman, as if she had just spoken in a foreign language. She refused? Again? Patricia forced out a light chuckle, one that barely masked her frustration. "Well, that's disappointing," she said, keeping her voice light, even as she felt her pulse hammering beneath her skin. The flight attendant nodded sympathetically. "I understand," she said gently. "I do apologize, but unfortunately we're fully booked today." Patricia swallowed down the bitter taste in her mouth and nodded. "Of course, no problem," she said, forcing a smile. The flight attendant gave her a polite nod before continuing down the aisle. Patricia let out a slow, controlled breath. She had lost, again, and Monica, she was still sitting there, smug, unbothered, arrogant. Patricia curled her hands into fists, pressing them into her lap. She was done being polite, done being reasonable. Monica had made a choice, a very deliberate choice. And now, Patricia was going to make one of her own. She wasn't going to let this slide. Not now, not after everything. Her mind raced with possibilities, with the next move she could make. Monica might have thought she had won, but Patricia wasn't about to go down that easily. No, if Monica wanted a battle, then Patricia was more than happy to give her one. She just had to be smart about it. She had to be careful. She had to make sure she came out on top. And she already had an idea how to do it. Patricia's gaze flicked toward the call button above her seat. Her finger hovered over it for just a second, just long enough to savor the moment. Then she pressed it and waited. Patricia tapped her fingernails against her armrest, her irritation solidifying into something colder, something sharper. She had given Monica every chance to do the right thing. She had been reasonable. She had been polite. And yet, Monica had rejected her, dismissed her, like her needs, her comfort, her importance didn't even matter. And now, Patricia was done playing nice. She had tried to reason with Monica. She had even gotten the flight attendant involved, hoping that a little bit of authority would make Monica reconsider. But instead, Monica had stood her ground. She had refused again, not just to be difficult, but to prove a point. Patricia's stomach twisted with resentment. Monica wanted to assert herself, to act like she was in control of the situation. Well, that wasn't how this was going to end. If Monica thought she could just say no and go back to her business like nothing had happened, she was wrong. Patricia glanced at the call button she had just pressed. It was time to take this to the next level. She wasn't going to let Monica win. She was going to make sure Monica regretted this. A flight attendant approached, the same one who had spoken to her earlier. She offered Patricia a polite professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. Is there something else I can assist you with?" Patricia inhaled sharply, shifting slightly in her seat as if she were uncomfortable, playing up her frustration just enough. "I'm sorry to bother you again," she began, keeping her voice soft, controlled. "But I just wanted to let you know I've been feeling a little uneasy about that woman back there." The flight attendant's brows furrowed slightly. "Uneasy?" Patricia nodded, lowering her voice. "Yes. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but when I asked her nicely about switching seats, she got, well, a little aggressive." The words rolled off her tongue smoothly, effortlessly. She wasn't lying, not exactly. Monica had been firm, almost cold in her refusal. Wasn't that aggressive in a way? The flight attendant's expression remained neutral. Aggressive how? Patricia tilted her head, choosing her words carefully. She just seemed very defensive, almost like she was looking for an argument. Patricia sighed, shaking her head as if she were trying to brush it off. "I just felt a little uncomfortable, that's all. I wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any issues later in the flight." The flight attendant's lips pressed together, as if considering the claim. Patricia watched her closely, gauging her reaction. She had planted the seed. Now, all she had to do was let it take root. The flight attendant glanced toward row 18, where Monica was still flipping through her folder, completely unaware of the conversation happening at the front of the plane. After a pause, the attendant offered Patricia another reassuring smile. "Thank you for letting us know," she said, her voice professional but gentle. "If anything happens, don't hesitate to call us." Patricia nodded, as if the response satisfied her. But deep down, she was furious. That wasn't enough. Monica deserved more than a warning. She deserved to feel just as uneasy as Patricia did. Patricia's mind whirred, working through the possibilities. She couldn't make Monica switch seats, but she could make her life difficult. She could make sure everyone on this plane started looking at her with suspicion. And maybe, just maybe, if Patricia played this right, she could make someone else step in. Her fingers curled around her armrest as the gears in her head kept turning. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The plane had settled into cruising altitude, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Patricia sat still, pretending to read the in-flight magazine, though she wasn't processing a single word. Instead, she was listening, watching, waiting. The flight attendant had walked away, but Patricia knew her words were still lingering in the woman's mind. Flight attendants were trained to watch for problems, to listen for disturbances. All Patricia had done was give them a reason to pay attention, a reason to keep an eye on Monica. And sure enough, Patricia noticed a shift. The flight attendants moved a little differently now, glancing toward the back of the plane more often. One of them even lingered near row 18 for a moment longer than necessary, watching Monica as she jotted something down in her folder. Patricia smirked to herself. It was working. Monica didn't even realize what was happening. She was still sitting there, still acting like nothing was wrong. But Patricia knew people were noticing, and once doubt was planted, it had a way of growing. She just had to feed it. She glanced at the man sitting beside her, middle-aged, polite-looking, dressed in business casual. Someone who might believe her if she played this right. Patricia leaned toward him slightly, lowering her voice. "Hey," she said softly, as if reluctant to speak up. "Did you happen to see what happened earlier with that woman in the back?" The man blinked, surprised. No, why?" Patricia sighed, shaking her head. I don't know, she was kind of rude to me earlier. I asked her to switch seats and she got really defensive. The man frowned slightly, glancing toward row 18. She seemed aggressive about it, Patricia added, lowering her voice even more. I don't want to assume anything, but it just made me a little uneasy. The man hesitated, but he looked again, and that was all Patricia needed. She could see it in his face. The seed had been planted again, and now it was only a matter of time before Monica started to feel it. That weight of suspicion, that shift in the air. She might have refused Patricia's request, but Patricia was going to make sure she paid for it. The plane cruised steadily through the sky, the hum of the engines filling the cabin with a low, constant vibration. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles, offering drinks and small packets of pretzels. Some passengers had already settled into their in-flight routines, reading, watching movies, dozing off, but Patricia Lawson sat in rigid silence, her irritation simmering beneath her composed exterior. She couldn't let it go. Even as she sat in her original seat, flipping through the in-flight magazine without absorbing a single word, she could still feel Monica Reynolds' refusal pressing down on her. It was like a thorn embedded beneath her skin, small, but impossible to ignore. She had expected Monica to cave, to be reasonable, to understand that Patricia's needs, her comfort, mattered. But no. Instead, Monica had dismissed her, turned her down as if Patricia's request was insignificant. And now she was just sitting there, all the way in row 18, unbothered, untouched, as if the entire interaction had meant nothing to her. Patricia gritted her teeth, her fingers tightening against the glossy pages of the magazine. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about power. Monica had wanted to make a point, that she didn't have to listen to Patricia, that she could just say no and go back to her work as if nothing had happened. The audacity of it made Patricia's skin crawl. She had spent her entire life knowing how the world worked, knowing how to navigate it. People like Monica, women who thought they could assert themselves, challenge people like Patricia, they didn't win. And yet, here she was, sitting comfortably by the window, acting like she had won something. Patricia exhaled sharply, forcing herself to breathe. She wasn't going to let this go unanswered. She refused to let Monica sit there, smug and satisfied, thinking she had put Patricia in her place. Patricia might not have gotten her seat, but she could still make sure Monica felt uncomfortable. She could make sure Monica knew that her behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. And more than that, she could make sure the rest of the plane saw it too. Patricia's eyes flicked across the cabin. The flight attendants had returned to their stations, preparing the next round of service. The man sitting next to her, the one she had subtly planted doubt in earlier, had his laptop open, but he wasn't typing. He was thinking. She had seen it in his face when she mentioned Monica earlier. That pause. That tiny, barely perceptible hesitation before he looked back toward row 18. Patricia knew what it meant. It meant she had planted a seed. Now, she just had to water it. She leaned back slightly, stretching as if casually shifting in her seat, then let out a small, controlled sigh. The man beside her glanced over. "Everything okay?" he asked politely. Patricia offered him a tight-lipped smile, as if she were debating whether to speak. "Oh, it's nothing," she said lightly, shaking her head. I hate feeling uncomfortable on flights, that's all." The man frowned slightly. "Something wrong?" Patricia let out another soft sigh, just loud enough to be heard, but not so loud that it sounded dramatic. "Not wrong, exactly," she said, lowering her voice as if she were reluctant to say more. It's silly really, but after that whole thing with that woman in the back, I guess I just got a little thrown off." The man's brow furrowed. "The one you asked to switch seats with?" Patricia nodded, allowing a slight hesitation, as if she were choosing her words carefully. Patricia sighed again, pressing her lips together. She got very defensive. I wasn't demanding anything. I just thought maybe she'd be willing to switch. But she acted like I was asking for something unreasonable. The man exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Some people just don't want to be considerate, I guess." Patricia gave a small, understanding smile. "I tried to let it go," she continued, her voice soft, measured, "but I don't know. The way she reacted, it just didn't sit right with me." The man frowned. "What do you mean?" Patricia hesitated, just long enough to let the air between them feel heavy. Then, with a carefully timed glance toward the back of the plane, she lowered her voice even further. "I don't know," she murmured, shaking her head slightly. "It just felt personal, you know?" She let the words linger, as if she had spoken something that even she wasn't sure she should have said. The man blinked, looking toward row 18 again, his expression more thoughtful this time. Patricia could tell. He was considering it now, considering whether there had been more to Monica's refusal than just the seat. And that was exactly what Patricia wanted. She wasn't going to accuse Monica outright. She wasn't going to say something that could backfire on her. But she was going to make sure doubt spread through the plane like ripples in water. And soon, Monica would feel it too. She would notice the looks, the shift in energy, the subtle, unspoken tension that came when people started questioning her intentions. Patricia felt a small, cold sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. This wasn't over, not yet. She had lost the seat battle, but she was still very much in control of the war. And Monica Reynolds? She was going to feel it. She was going to regret it, and Patricia was going to make damn sure of that. The fasten seatbelt sign flicked on as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent. Around the cabin, passengers began adjusting their seatbelts, closing their tray tables, and stretching in anticipation of landing. Some murmured quietly about connecting flights and upcoming plans, but Patricia Lawson barely noticed. She sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her entire body coiled with tension. She had spent the last few hours letting her resentment simmer, feeding it with every glance toward row 18, where Monica Reynolds still sat, unbothered, untouched by the undercurrent of hostility Patricia had subtly spread throughout the plane. Patricia had expected her little whispers, her carefully planted seeds of doubt, to have an effect by now. She had expected Monica to notice the shift, to feel the pressure, but nothing. Monica had spent the entire flight focused on her notes, seemingly immune to the silent judgment brewing around her. It infuriated Patricia. She wanted Monica to feel uncomfortable. She wanted Monica to regret refusing her. And since that hadn't happened during the flight, Patricia was determined to make it happen now. The wheels hit the tarmac with a gentle bounce, and the cabin filled with the familiar jostling of a plane touching down. A few passengers sighed in relief, some stretching, others reaching for their phones the moment the seatbelt sign turned off. The second it did, Patricia sprang into action. She unbuckled her seatbelt aggressively, standing up before anyone else had even begun collecting their belongings. Instead of reaching for her bag, she turned, her eyes locked on Monica as she strode down the aisle, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Monica was just setting down her folder when Patricia stopped directly beside her row, her voice sharp, cutting through the cabin noise like a blade. "I don't want you anywhere near me," Patricia snapped, loud enough that the surrounding passengers immediately turned their heads. Monica looked up, her brows lifting slightly, clearly caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Patricia said, her tone dripping with accusation. She tilted her chin up, letting the tension in the air thicken. "You made this flight miserable with your attitude, and I'm not going to just let it go." A hush fell over the passengers closest to them. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, others whispered amongst themselves. Monica, however, remained collected, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "Patricia," she said, her voice even. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Patricia folded her arms, shaking her head in mock disbelief. "You know exactly what you did. The way you acted when I politely asked you to switch seats. The way you've been sitting back here, all smug, like you're better than everyone else." She gestured around as if to rally the surrounding passengers to her side. "You were aggressive with me when I asked you something completely reasonable," Patricia continued, her voice rising. "And now you're going to sit here and pretend like nothing happened? Like you weren't rude? Like you weren't hostile?" Monica's jaw tightened slightly. The word hostile had landed exactly how Patricia had intended it to. There it was, the accusation that could make people look at Monica differently, make them question her. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, their expressions flickering with hesitation. From the front of the plane, a flight attendant hurried toward them, her voice edged with concern. "Ladies, is there a problem?" Patricia turned to her immediately, seizing the moment. "Yes, there's a problem," she declared loudly. "I want someone to call security. This woman has been harassing me this entire flight." A collective gasp rippled through the surrounding rows. Monica's expression barely changed, but Patricia could see the way her fingers subtly curled into a fist. She was pushing Monica into a corner. She was making everyone watch, and the more eyes that were on them, the more power Patricia had. The flight attendant held up a hand, her expression now one of careful neutrality. "Ma'am, can you please clarify what happened?" Patricia exhaled sharply, her voice trembling with carefully crafted frustration. "I tried to be civil, I really did," she said, shaking her head. "I asked her a simple question nicely, and she snapped at me, refused to cooperate. And now, when I tried to leave, she started making me uncomfortable." The man who had been sitting next to Patricia earlier shifted in his seat, looking between the two women. He wasn't fully convinced, but Patricia could tell he was at least considering her side. That was all she needed. "I just want to make sure nothing happens when we get off the plane," Patricia added, folding her arms across her chest. "I don't feel safe." The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Monica. Monica, who was still calm, still composed, but Patricia could see the tightness in her shoulders now. Patricia knew exactly what was going through Monica's head. If she defended herself, it would be seen as aggression. If she stayed silent, it would be seen as guilt. And that was why Patricia had won. The weight of suspicion had already settled over Monica's shoulders, and there was nothing she could do about it. The flight attendant took a step back, speaking into her radio. "We may need assistance at the gate," she murmured. Monica's jaw tightened further, but she didn't say a word. She just looked at Patricia, her eyes dark and unreadable. Patricia held her gaze, unwavering, victorious. When the doors finally opened, a uniformed officer was waiting outside the jet bridge. Passengers whispered as they began filing out, glancing over their shoulders at Monica as she gathered her belongings. Patricia walked off the plane first, her chin held high, her posture stiff with false indignation. Monica followed soon after, flanked by the watchful eyes of the flight crew and the officer. She wasn't in handcuffs, she wasn't arrested, but the damage had already been done. Patricia didn't need Monica to be taken away. She just needed people to see her differently. And that was already happening. As she strode toward the terminal, Patricia allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. She might not have gotten the seat she wanted, but she had made sure Monica knew exactly who was in control. And that, to Patricia, was what really mattered. The moment Patricia Lawson stepped off the plane, she felt a swell of satisfaction rise in her chest. She had won. She could hear the whispers around her, the hushed voices of passengers who had witnessed her confrontation with Monica Reynolds. Some glanced at Monica with thinly veiled suspicion. Others looked curious, and a few exchanged knowing looks, as if silently confirming their assumptions. Patricia didn't need to do anything else. The seed of doubt had been planted. The damage was done. And now, as she strode into the terminal, her heels clicking against the polished floor, she saw exactly what she had expected to see. A uniformed officer standing just beyond the gate, waiting. Patricia's lips curled into a tight, triumphant smile. She had known this would happen. She had counted on it. The mere suggestion of a threat had been enough to trigger a response. That was the beauty of knowing how to play the game. As the last few passengers trickled into the terminal, Monica finally stepped through the jet bridge, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The officer immediately took a step forward. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Monica with the kind of measured authority that made people pay attention, "I need to have a word with you." A few passengers slowed their steps, lingering just within earshot, their curiosity undeniable. Monica stopped, her grip firm on the handle of her leather briefcase. She didn't flinch, didn't panic. She just looked at the officer, her face carefully neutral. "What's this about?" she asked. Patricia took a calculated step forward, her voice laced with feigned relief. "Oh, officer, I'm so glad you're here," she said, shaking her head as if shaken by the ordeal. "I was really hoping someone would follow up on this. She placed a hand on her chest, exhaling shakily. "I didn't feel safe on that flight." The officer's gaze flicked between Patricia and Monica. "Safe?" he repeated, his tone even but firm. Patricia nodded quickly. "Yes, I hate to escalate things, but this woman," she gestured vaguely toward Monica, "was acting well, let's just say she was aggressive toward me. And after what's been happening on flights these days, I just thought it was best to report it." There it was, the unspoken implication, the suggestion that Monica was a problem, a potential threat. The officer turned back to Monica. "Ma'am, can you explain your side of this?" Monica's expression didn't shift. She had seen this before. She had felt this before, the moment where suspicion had already been assigned to her before she had even spoken a word. But she knew how to handle this. She wouldn't let Patricia control the narrative. "I'd be happy to," Monica said, her voice steady, controlled. "But first, I'd like to ask, am I being detained?" The officer blinked, slightly taken aback. "No, ma'am, I just need to clarify the situation." Monica nodded. "Good, then let's clarify." She shifted her weight slightly, still holding the officer's gaze. "This woman," she said, gesturing toward Patricia with the same calm precision, "asked me to switch seats. I declined." She didn't like that answer. And instead of letting it go, she tried to escalate the situation for the remainder of the flight. She let the words hang in the air. The officer's expression remained neutral, but Patricia bristled. "That's not true," Patricia interjected, her voice rising slightly. "I was perfectly polite, but you—" Monica held up a hand. "I'm speaking now." The authority in her voice made Patricia pause, her face flushing with frustration. The officer glanced between them before nodding at Monica. "Go on." Monica didn't hesitate. "She didn't get her way, so she started whispering to other passengers, painting me as hostile. She even spoke to a flight attendant, twisting the situation to make it sound like I was a problem. She tilted her head slightly, letting the officer absorb that information. If you need confirmation, I suggest you ask the flight crew. They'll tell you exactly what happened. Patricia stiffened. The officer's expression shifted ever so slightly. I was just looking out for safety, Patricia said quickly, but there was a slight waver in her voice now. Monica arched a brow. Safety? She repeated, her tone cool, pointed. Because I refused to give up my seat? Patricia opened her mouth, but before she could respond, the flight attendant from earlier appeared. Officer? She said, stepping closer. I think I can clear this up. Patricia's stomach twisted. The officer nodded. Please do. The flight attendant turned toward Monica. She didn't do anything wrong, she said plainly. The only issue we had on board was this woman, she gestured to Patricia, repeatedly trying to pressure another passenger to move. We spoke to Ms. Reynolds ourselves, and she was nothing but cooperative. The words landed like a hammer. The tension in Patricia's shoulders coiled tighter. The officer studied the flight attendant for a moment before turning back to Patricia. Well, ma'am, he said evenly, from what I'm hearing, there's no actual complaint to pursue here. Patricia's cheeks burned. I was just trying to make sure everything was handled properly, she said stiffly, her voice now noticeably weaker. The officer gave her a long, unreadable look before nodding. Understood, he said, but unless you have actual evidence of a disturbance, there's nothing more for me to do here. He turned back to Monica. Ma'am, you're free to go. Monica nodded once. Thank you, she said, her voice steady, but there was a flicker of something colder in her eyes when she glanced at Patricia. She turned on her heel, walking away without looking back. Patricia stood there, frozen, as the crowd around her slowly dissipated. She could feel it, the weight of the stairs, the shift in energy. She had played her cards, but they had been turned against her. And now, she was the one left standing in the middle of the terminal, humiliated. As Monica disappeared into the bustling airport, Patricia swallowed the lump in her throat. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen to her. But for the first time since she stepped on that plane, she had no control over what happened next. Patricia Lawson stood frozen in the middle of the terminal, her breath shallow, her hands curled into fists at her sides. The scene around her continued as if nothing had happened. Passengers moving past, families reuniting, airport staff guiding travelers to their connecting flights. But to Patricia, the world had shifted. She had lost control of the narrative. She had expected Monica Reynolds to be confronted, to be questioned, to be put in her place. She had expected validation, confirmation that her instincts had been correct. Instead, she had been left standing there, exposed, her accusations dismissed outright. The officer's words still echoed in her head. There's no actual complaint to pursue here. Patricia felt heat creep up her neck, her skin tingling as she realized what had just happened. People had witnessed it. They had seen her try to turn the situation against Monica, and they had seen it fall apart in real time. As Monica disappeared into the crowd, Patricia became painfully aware of the people still lingering nearby. A few passengers who had been on the flight were watching her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disapproval. The man she had whispered to earlier, the one she had tried to sway, was now looking at her differently, as if he were reevaluating her entirely. She could feel it, the change in the air. Where before she had been the victim, the concerned passenger just trying to ensure her safety, now she was something else. She was the one who had lied, the one who had pushed too far, the one who had tried to manipulate the situation and failed. The realization made her stomach twist. For the first time, a cold, uncomfortable thought crept into her mind. Had she gone too far? She had just wanted Monica to feel pressure, to feel uneasy, the way Patricia had felt when her request had been denied. But now, standing in the middle of the terminal, she was the one who felt exposed. Vulnerable, weak. Patricia swallowed hard, lifting her chin slightly, forcing herself to move. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from this moment before it cemented itself in her memory any further. She reached for her suitcase and pulled up the handle, her movements quick, jerky. She could still feel the weight of their eyes on her, burning into the back of her skull. As she turned toward the exit, she spotted the flight attendant who had spoken to the officer, the one who had defended Monica. The woman met Patricia's gaze directly, her expression unreadable. Patricia's mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to say something, to argue, to defend herself, but no words came out. What could she even say? The truth was already out. She had made a scene, only for it to backfire spectacularly. She quickly averted her gaze and pushed forward, walking briskly toward the baggage claim area, forcing herself not to look back. The further she walked, the more the noise of the airport blurred around her. Her mind raced. Her thoughts swirled between anger, embarrassment, and something else. Something she didn't want to name. Regret? No. She didn't want to call it that. She didn't regret standing her ground. She didn't regret trying to prove a point. What she regretted was being caught in the lie. What she regretted was losing control of the situation. Patricia reached the baggage carousel, standing stiffly beside the other passengers as she waited for her luggage. She could see her reflection in the glossy metal of the conveyor belt. Her stiff posture, her tight expression, the way her lips were pressed together in a firm line. She looked different, not like the woman who had stepped onto that plane in control, not like the woman who had assumed that people would take her side. She looked uncertain. For the first time in a long time, Patricia felt small. Her suitcase finally appeared, and she grabbed it quickly, eager to disappear into the airport crowd. As she turned toward the exit, she spotted Monica once more, just beyond the glass doors, waiting for a ride. Unlike Patricia, Monica didn't seem flustered. She stood with poise, her phone in one hand, her briefcase in the other. She wasn't looking around, wasn't checking to see if anyone was watching her. She didn't need to. She had walked away from the entire ordeal with her dignity intact. Patricia's grip tightened on the handle of her suitcase. She hated that. She hated that Monica hadn't cracked, hadn't lashed out, hadn't given her anything to use against her. Instead, Monica had just won. And Patricia had to live with that reality. She inhaled sharply, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the exit. She would go home. She would forget this happened. She would convince herself that she had been right all along. And yet, as she stepped into the fresh air outside the terminal, that nagging feeling still clung to her. A feeling she couldn't quite shake. A feeling she didn't want to name. Because for the first time, deep down, she wasn't entirely sure if she had been right at all. Monica Reynolds stepped into the crisp evening air outside the airport, rolling her carry-on suitcase behind her. The ordeal with Patricia Lawson was already behind her, reduced to nothing more than an unpleasant inconvenience, one she had handled with grace, as she always did. She had spent too many years navigating these situations to let them define her. The truth had been on her side. And as always, the truth had prevailed. Monica didn't waste time dwelling on moments like these. She had work to do. She had a mission to accomplish. Her car service arrived, and she slid into the back seat, exhaling as she pulled out her phone. A flood of emails and notifications filled the screen, most of them work-related. She scanned through them quickly, making mental notes of what needed her attention. One email stood out, a confirmation from the event coordinator for the Community Leaders Summit, where she was scheduled to be the keynote speaker the following day. Monica smiled to herself. This was the real reason she was here, not for a petty confrontation on an airplane, not to waste time arguing with people who refused to see her worth. She was here to inspire change, and she wasn't about to let anything or anyone distract her from that. The next morning, Monica walked into the grand conference hall of the Community Leaders Summit, a polished, modern venue filled with some of the most influential voices in philanthropy and social justice. The energy in the room was electric, people networking, exchanging ideas, forming alliances to push forward meaningful initiatives. Monica had been to countless events like this, yet each time she felt the same renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just here to speak, she was here to make a difference. As she moved through the crowd, several attendees approached her with warm greetings. "Monica, it's so good to see you again. I read about your latest project. Phenomenal work as always. We need your insight on a new educational program we're developing. Do you have time to chat?" Monica smiled graciously, shaking hands and making connections. She had worked hard to build this reputation, one of integrity, leadership, and unwavering commitment to progress. And she had no intention of slowing down. Later that afternoon, Monica took the stage as the keynote speaker, standing before a packed auditorium of leaders, activists, and visionaries. The room fell into silence as she stepped up to the podium. She took a steady breath, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over her. Then she began. "When we talk about change, we often think about large sweeping actions, massive movements, policy shifts, systemic reform," she said, her voice strong and assured. "But true change starts in the small moments, in the everyday decisions we make, in the way we choose to treat one another, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard." She let her words linger, making sure they resonated. She thought about the plane ride, about Patricia, about the choice she had made to stand her ground. Each of us has the power to challenge bias, to dismantle injustice, to reject the narratives that try to tell us we are less than, Monica continued. "It is not always comfortable, it is not always easy, but it is always necessary." A wave of nods moved through the audience. Some people leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every word. Others took notes, writing down key points to carry with them beyond this room. Monica's eyes scanned the crowd, seeing a mix of determination, reflection, and quiet resolve on the faces before her. This was why she did what she did, not for validation, not for recognition, but because every conversation mattered. Every step forward made a difference. Every seed of change planted today would blossom into something greater tomorrow. As she concluded her speech, the room erupted into applause, not just polite claps, but genuine appreciation. Several people rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Monica felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she didn't allow herself to linger in the moment for too long. There was always more work to be done. She spent the rest of the afternoon engaging in discussions, forming partnerships, and planning for the future. By the time the event ended, she had secured new funding for scholarship programs, connected with organizations working to expand educational access, and outlined strategies for community-driven solutions. She left the conference exhausted, but fulfilled. This was what it meant to build a legacy, not through arguments on an airplane, but through actions that created real, lasting change. That evening, Monica sat in her hotel room, sipping a glass of tea as she reviewed the day's accomplishments. She had done exactly what she came here to do. She had made progress. She had pushed forward. And as for Patricia, she hadn't thought about her once since stepping off that plane. That in itself was a victory. Because at the end of the day, people like Patricia would always exist. There would always be those who sought to diminish others, to undermine, to control. But Monica had long since learned that the best response wasn't anger or revenge. The best response was success. It was standing tall. It was continuing forward, unshaken, unstoppable, and unwavering. Monica set down her tea, letting a small, satisfied smile cross her lips. Tomorrow, she had another meeting, another initiative to lead, another opportunity to make a difference. And she was ready for it. She always had been. She always would be. Patricia Lawson sat stiffly in her hotel room, a half-empty glass of wine on the nightstand beside her. The events of the past 24 hours replayed in her mind like a loop she couldn't escape. She had lost. She had walked off that plane believing she had won, believing she had controlled the narrative, that she had left Monica Reynolds humiliated. But instead, she had been the one standing there, exposed, her accusations dismissed outright. The way people had looked at her after the truth came out, it had been unbearable. She had never been in a situation like that before. Never had she felt so powerless, so wrong. And the worst part? Monica had just walked away. No reaction, no anger, no confrontation. It was as if Patricia had been nothing more than a mild inconvenience in her day. That was what stung the most. Monica had refused to engage in the battle Patricia had been trying to start, and in doing so, she had won without even trying. Patricia took a slow sip of wine, her jaw tightening. It still didn't sit right with her. Monica had acted like she was better than her, so calm, so unaffected, like she knew something Patricia didn't. And now, sitting alone in the dim glow of her hotel lamp, Patricia found herself fixated on that thought. Who was Monica Reynolds, really? Patricia reached for her phone and typed the name into a search bar. Monica Reynolds. At first, nothing unusual appeared, just social media accounts, a few generic LinkedIn profiles, scattered mentions of people with the same name. But then, Patricia's finger froze over the screen, because there it was. An article from a major business magazine headlined, "Monica Reynolds, the woman changing the future of philanthropy." Patricia's eyes widened. She clicked on it immediately, her heart pounding as she scanned the page. The article was a feature piece, detailing Monica's rise in the corporate world, her transition into philanthropy, her leadership in multi-million-dollar initiatives designed to uplift underserved communities. There were photos, too. Professional images of Monica speaking at conferences, shaking hands with world leaders, standing on the steps of a university she had helped fund. Patricia stared at the screen, barely breathing. She had spent the entire flight, the entire day, treating this woman like she was some random nobody. And yet, Monica Reynolds wasn't just somebody. She was somebody important, somebody with power, somebody who mattered. And Patricia had tried to take her down. Patricia leaned back against the pillows, her pulse racing. She thought about everything. The way Monica had carried herself, the way she had refused to be rattled, the way she had walked away from the situation without a second thought. Of course she had. Because she had nothing to lose, she was untouchable. Patricia felt a rush of something sharp in her chest. Was it regret? Was it shame? She didn't know. All she knew was that she had misjudged Monica completely. She had assumed that Monica had no status, no influence, no importance. She had assumed Monica would be easy to push around. She had assumed Monica was someone who couldn't fight back. And yet Monica hadn't needed to fight back at all. She had let the truth do the work for her. And now Patricia sat in her hotel room, realizing that she had picked a battle with a woman who was far beyond her reach. Patricia's hands trembled slightly as she set her phone down on the nightstand. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. She had publicly accused a high-profile philanthropist of being aggressive. What if word got out? What if the wrong person had overheard? What if someone from the business world, someone connected to Patricia's own industry, knew Monica personally? What if this came back to haunt her? Patricia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to breathe through the sudden anxiety. This had been a mistake, a massive one. She should have let it go on the plane. She should have never pushed so hard. But it was too late for that now. The damage was done. Patricia sat there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, grappling with the weight of it all. She had always seen herself as a good person, as someone who knew right from wrong. But for the first time, she was being forced to confront an ugly reality. She had made assumptions about Monica that had nothing to do with her character. She had assumed she could get away with it, and that assumption had been based on something deeper, something she didn't want to admit to herself. She had looked at Monica, her confidence, her composure, and instead of seeing a professional woman traveling for business, she had seen someone she could undermine, and now she was sitting alone, stewing in the consequences of that mistake. For the first time in her life, Patricia felt like she had been forced to look in the mirror, and she didn't like what she saw. Patricia swallowed hard and reached for her phone again. Her thumb hovered over the screen as if tempted to send an email, a message, some kind of apology. But what would she even say? I misjudged you. I was wrong. I let my assumptions get the best of me. She wasn't sure she was ready to say those words out loud. Instead, she set the phone back down, her stomach twisting with unease. For the first time, Patricia had to ask herself a question she had never considered before. What if I was the problem all along? And that, more than anything, was a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Patricia Lawson sat motionless in the stiff hotel chair, staring at her phone screen, rereading the article on Monica Reynolds for what felt like the 100th time. The words blurred together, but their meaning was inescapable. She had tried to humiliate Monica. She had assumed the worst about her, and now she knew the truth. Monica Reynolds wasn't just anyone. She was a woman of power, influence, and integrity. And Patricia had been wrong about her in every possible way. She set her phone down with trembling fingers, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. For the first time since stepping onto that plane, she felt something she wasn't prepared for. Regret, not just embarrassment, not just the sting of losing control of the situation, but deep, genuine regret. Because the more she thought about it, the more she realized she hadn't just misjudged Monica. She had wronged her. Patricia exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. She had always seen herself as a good person. She had always believed she was fair, reasonable, and considerate. But this situation had forced her to confront something uglier, something she had never wanted to acknowledge about herself. She had felt entitled to Monica's seat. She had felt offended when Monica refused. She had lashed out, convincing herself that she was the victim when, in reality, she had been the one escalating the situation. And the worst part? She had assumed things about Monica based on nothing more than her own biases. The realization made her stomach twist with discomfort. If Monica had been someone else, someone Patricia perceived as having more status or importance, would she have treated her the same way? Would she have demanded the seat swap? Would she have tried to turn people against her? The answer settled over her like a cold, crushing weight. Probably not. She had looked at Monica and made assumptions, and when Monica had stood her ground, Patricia had seen it as defiance rather than simple self-respect. She squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could go back and undo it all. But it was too late for that now. Patricia leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her mind racing. She thought about the moment in the terminal, when Monica had been approached by the police officer. She had wanted Monica to feel small, to feel humiliated. But instead, Monica had been calm, composed, and dignified, while Patricia had been the one left feeling exposed. She thought about the passengers on the plane, the way their expressions had shifted when they realized what was really happening. She had started the flight believing she was in the right. She had ended it realizing she had been the problem all along. And now, no matter how much she wanted to distance herself from it, the truth wouldn't let go. She had failed herself. She had failed the person she claimed to be. Patricia stared at her phone again, Monica's name still glowing on the screen. A new thought struck her, one that made her heart race with uncertainty. Should she reach out? Should she apologize? Would Monica even care? She hesitated, chewing on the inside of her cheek. Would an apology even mean anything after everything she had done? Would it sound Hollow, like she was only saying it to clear her own conscience? She wasn't sure, but what she did know was that she couldn't just sit here and do nothing. She had spent an entire day convinced she was the one who had been wronged, when in reality, she had been the one causing harm. And for once, she had to take responsibility for that. Slowly, Patricia opened a new email. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the blank screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, cautiously, she began to type. Monica, I don't expect you to respond to this email, but I wanted to reach out because I need to say something that I should have said a long time ago. I'm sorry. She stopped, rereading the words, feeling the weight of them. It wasn't enough. She had to be honest, truly honest, for the first time. She took a breath and kept going. I owe you an apology, not just for how I acted on the flight, but for the way I treated you. The truth is, I made assumptions about you, and I let those assumptions dictate how I behaved. I convinced myself that I was in the right when I was actually being unreasonable. She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed the next words. I see now that I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I was wrong, and I am deeply sorry. She stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to send it or delete it. Part of her still hated the idea of admitting she had been so terribly wrong, but another part of her knew this was bigger than her pride. This was about owning her mistakes. Finally, with a deep breath, she clicked send, and as the email disappeared from her screen, Patricia felt something she hadn't felt since stepping off that plane. A strange, unfamiliar sense of relief. She couldn't change what had happened. She couldn't undo the harm she had caused. But at least, for the first time, she had taken responsibility for it. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward becoming a better person. Monica Reynolds sat in her home office, her eyes scanning the seemingly endless list of emails waiting for her attention. Sponsorship proposals, conference invitations, logistical updates for her latest initiative. It was a typical day, filled with the usual demands of her work. But one email stood out. The subject line was simple, apology. Monica's brow furrowed slightly as she clicked it open. And there it was, a message from Patricia Lawson. Monica exhaled slowly, her fingers hovering over the mouse as she read through the email, taking in every word. It was honest, if nothing else. Patricia hadn't made excuses. She hadn't tried to justify her actions. She had admitted that she was wrong, that she had let her biases control her, that she had misjudged Monica entirely, and that she was sorry. Monica leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple as she processed the weight of it. She had not expected this. People like Patricia rarely apologized, at least not with sincerity. They justified, they deflected, they convinced themselves they had done nothing wrong. But Patricia had actually acknowledged it. And that was something Monica couldn't ignore. For a moment, Monica considered not responding at all. She owed Patricia nothing. She had moved past the incident days ago, buried it beneath the real work that demanded her attention. But as much as she had left it behind, she knew that silence carried weight too. And in some way, Patricia had taken a step. Not a grand one, not one that erased what she had done, but a step nonetheless. Monica exhaled sharply and began to type. Patricia, I appreciate you reaching out. Acknowledging the harm we cause, whether intentional or not, is never easy, and I recognize that it takes humility to do so. I accept your apology. That said, an apology does not erase the impact of our actions, and it does not create an obligation for forgiveness to lead to reconciliation. I have moved on from what happened, but I do hope that you take this as an opportunity to reflect, not just on this moment, but on the broader patterns that led to it. We all have work to do when it comes to unlearning biases and choosing to see people as they are, rather than as we assume them to be. I hope you continue that work. Take care, Monica Reynolds. She reread it once, then again. It was measured, firm, final. She had accepted Patricia's apology, but she had not welcomed her into her world because some distances were meant to remain. She hit send, and just like that, she moved on. Across the city, Patricia sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, her heart hammering as she stared at the new email notification. Her hands felt cold as she clicked on it. She had expected Monica to ignore her completely, but she had responded. Patricia's eyes moved over the words slowly, her breath catching at the finality of it. Monica had accepted her apology, but she had also made it clear. This wasn't about making amends and becoming friends. This wasn't about wiping the slate clean. This was about accountability. Monica had left no room for Patricia to convince herself that a simple apology undid the harm. Patricia swallowed hard, her chest tightening. She had hoped somehow that saying sorry would feel like an ending. But instead, it felt like the beginning of something much harder. It meant she had to live with the consequences of her actions. It meant she had to sit with the discomfort of knowing she couldn't fix this, that some things simply couldn't be undone. And for the first time, Patricia understood. Apologies were not for erasing the past. They were for learning from it. Monica closed her laptop, pushing the encounter from her mind as she turned her attention back to her real work. Her life wasn't shaped by moments like these. She had a mission, one far bigger than Patricia Lawson. She had communities to uplift, policies to advocate for, opportunities to create for those who truly needed them. She wasn't going to waste energy on resentment. Patricia was a reminder, a lesson in how bias manifests in everyday interactions. But she wasn't worth holding on to, and so, as she moved forward with her work, she left Patricia where she belonged, in the past. Patricia, on the other hand, sat with her cooling cup of coffee, staring at Monica's words. She had gotten the closure she had asked for, but not the closure she had wanted. There would be no redemption arc, no neatly tied resolution. Monica had forgiven her, but she had not forgotten. And that was something Patricia would have to carry on her own. Patricia Lawson sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the email Monica Reynolds had sent her. The words still lingered in her mind, unshaken even after multiple rereads. I accept your apology. But an apology does not erase the impact of our actions. Monica had forgiven her, but she had not forgotten. Patricia had expected something different, maybe a chance at redemption, a moment of reconciliation, a way to wipe the slate clean. But Monica had given her something else, a lesson, one that Patricia couldn't ignore. Because for the first time in her life she understood, a simple sorry wasn't enough. Real change had to be earned. The old version of herself would have brushed this off. She would have defended her actions, told herself she had just made a mistake, convinced herself that she wasn't like that she wasn't the kind of person who judged others unfairly. But now she wasn't so sure. She had spent the past few days thinking, really thinking, about how she had gotten to this point. And the truth was uncomfortable. She had walked onto that plane expecting deference. She had assumed that her request to switch seats would be met with cooperation, not resistance. She had reacted not just with disappointment, but with entitlement. And when Monica had stood her ground, she had done everything in her power to turn people against her. She had manipulated. She had whispered. She had played the role of victim, even when she was the one creating the problem. That was hard to admit, but she needed to. If she ever wanted to be better, she had to start by being honest with herself. Patricia reached for her phone and did something she had never done before. She searched for volunteer opportunities in her city. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to do it, only that she did. Maybe she needed to put herself in situations where she wasn't the one in control. Maybe she needed to listen to people whose lives had been shaped by experiences she had never considered. She clicked on a listing for a local food bank, scanning the details. They needed volunteers, people to help distribute meals, organize donations, assist families who relied on the pantry for their next meal. Patricia hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. This wasn't her world. She had always been distant from these kinds of realities. But wasn't that the problem? She took a deep breath and signed up. The following Saturday, Patricia arrived at the food bank, feeling an unfamiliar sense of nervousness settle in her chest. She had expected the room to be somber, heavy with the weight of hardship. Instead, she was met with warmth. People smiled as they worked, chatting as they sorted through canned goods and fresh produce. A volunteer coordinator, a woman named Elena, greeted her with a welcoming nod. First time? Elena asked, handing her a pair of gloves. Patricia nodded. Yeah, I just wanted to help. Elena smiled. Well, you're in the right place. Patricia spent the next few hours packing bags of groceries, handing them to families who came through the doors. She saw single mothers trying to provide for their children. She met elderly couples who had worked their whole lives but now struggled to afford food. She spoke with a teenager, no older than 16, who was picking up meals for his younger siblings because their parents worked multiple jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. And for the first time, Patricia felt small in the best way possible, because for the first time, she realized how little she actually knew. As she drove home that evening, Patricia found herself thinking about Monica again. She had seen Monica's face before, not just in that moment on the plane, but in the faces of some of the people she had helped today. Women who had learned to stand their ground. People who had been misjudged because of how they looked, where they came from, or what assumptions people made about them. People who had to fight for respect every single day. She had been part of the problem. She couldn't deny that anymore. But maybe, just maybe, she could do something to change that. Patricia didn't become a different person overnight. Change was slow, uncomfortable, and often painful. But she kept showing up. She kept volunteering. She started listening more and talking less. She read books about unlearning bias, sat in on community discussions, and forced herself to face the truths she had ignored for years. And little by little she began to understand, not just the way the world worked, but the way she had contributed to the very things she claimed to stand against. One evening, after months of reflection and quiet work, she found herself opening her email again. She hesitated for a long moment, then began to type. "Monica, I don't expect you to read this, but I wanted to say something. Your words stuck with me. Not just the ones in your email, but the ones you never had to say, the ones I had to figure out on my own. I've spent the last few months trying to be better, not just for the sake of making amends, but because I finally understand why I needed to. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just wanted to say that you changed me, and I'm grateful for that. Patricia." She stared at the message for a long time. Then, instead of sending it, she saved it as a draft. Because this wasn't about Monica anymore. It was about who Patricia was becoming. And for the first time, that was enough. Patricia Lawson sat on the park bench, a warm coffee in her hands, watching the world move around her. The air was crisp, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the distant laughter of children playing reached her ears. It had been months since that fateful flight. Months since she had stood in an airport terminal, humiliated by her own actions, exposed to truths she had long refused to see. And yet, the lesson still lingered. It wasn't just about Monica Reynolds anymore. It was about everything she had come to understand since then. She had once believed that understanding was passive, that if she considered herself a good person, if she avoided direct cruelty, then she was already on the right path. She now knew how wrong that was. Understanding required effort. Understanding meant recognizing the harm you cause even when you don't intend it. It meant listening, learning, and, most of all, changing. For a long time, Patricia had seen that moment on the plane as an isolated incident, an unfortunate misunderstanding, a mistake she could move past. But it wasn't just one moment, it was a pattern of expectation, of privilege, of assuming that the world would bend to her needs. And when it didn't, she had pushed back, not because she was right, but because she wasn't used to being told no. The truth was hard to swallow. But the more she sat with it, the more she realized how necessary it was. She had been given a choice to ignore what she had learned or to embrace the discomfort and grow from it. She had chosen growth, and in doing so, she had come to understand something even deeper. One of the hardest things Patricia had faced in the months since the incident was confronting her own blind spots. She had spent years assuming she understood the world, believing that fairness was a simple concept, that respect was given freely, that opportunities were the same for everyone. But her time volunteering at the food bank, listening to people's stories, seeing the struggles that so many faced, it had shattered those assumptions. She had met people who had worked twice as hard for half as much. She had spoken to women who had experienced the same dismissal and judgment she had thrown at Monica. And every single time she had felt the same sinking realization. I used to be the person who ignored this. I used to be the person who dismissed their experiences as exaggerations, as things that didn't really happen. She had been wrong, not just once on a plane, but in countless small ways throughout her life, ways she couldn't ignore anymore. Understanding begins with listening. Patricia had always thought of herself as someone who knew a lot, but she had come to realize that understanding wasn't about knowing, it was about listening. Listening without interrupting. Listening without waiting for a chance to defend yourself. Listening just to hear. She had spent months doing just that, sitting in on conversations she once would have dismissed, reading books she once would have ignored, having discussions that made her uncomfortable. And through it all, she had learned that understanding wasn't just about empathy. It was about action. It was about changing the way you move through the world. Patricia took a sip of her coffee, letting its warmth settle in her chest. She no longer saw the incident on the plane as something that ruined her day. She saw it as the moment that forced her to wake up, the moment that set her on a path of real self-reflection, the moment that made her question the person she had been and the person she wanted to become. She thought about Monica. She wondered if Monica had any idea how much that encounter had changed her. Probably not. And maybe that was okay. Because Patricia hadn't changed for Monica. She had changed for herself. For the people she had ignored for too long. For the person she had once been. And for the person she hoped to be. She still had a long way to go. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of that journey. She was ready for it. She welcomed it. Because understanding wasn't about a single moment of clarity. It was about what you chose to do with that clarity. And Patricia had made her choice. She would keep listening. She would keep learning. And most importantly, she would keep changing. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Sometimes these lessons come in small moments, a conversation, a disagreement, or a chance encounter with someone different from ourselves. Other times, they come as hard truths, the realization that we may have been wrong, that we may have judged unfairly, or that our actions, however unintentional, may have caused harm. But the greatest lesson of all is that it is never too late to grow. One of the most important things we can do as we move through life is to remain open to change. Many people believe that once we reach a certain age, our views, opinions, and habits are set in stone. But the reality is, growth does not stop with youth. It continues as long as we allow it. Wisdom is not just about what we have always known, it is about being willing to learn, listen, and evolve. This story about Monica and Patricia is a reminder that understanding begins with humility. It is easy to assume we know the world, to believe that our perspective is the correct one. But true wisdom comes from stepping outside of ourselves. When Patricia first met Monica, she saw only what she expected to see, someone who should accommodate her needs, someone who should defer to her wishes. But when Monica stood her ground, Patricia reacted not with understanding, but with resentment and entitlement. How often do we in our own lives dismiss others without realizing it? How often do we assume our struggles matter more than someone else's? It is a difficult truth to confront, but it is an essential one. As Patricia's journey unfolded, she realized that her assumptions were wrong, not just about Monica, but about the way she had viewed the world. She had to face the uncomfortable truth that she had been unfair, that she had let her own biases shape her behavior, and that her actions had real consequences. But rather than staying in her guilt, she chose to do something powerful. She chose to change, and that is what makes a difference. Life is not about never making mistakes. It is about what we do once we realize we've made them. It is about being willing to say, I was wrong, and even more importantly, I will do better. For those of us who have lived long enough to see the world change before our eyes, we must ask ourselves, are we still willing to change with it? Are we still willing to listen, learn, and grow? Empathy is not just a virtue, it is a choice we make every single day. It is a choice to see people for who they are, rather than who we assume them to be. It is a choice to lead with kindness, to stand up for what is right, and to reflect on our own actions with honesty and grace. This story is a reminder that even when we have spent years seeing the world a certain way, we are never too old to open our eyes a little wider. Growth is not about age, it is about character. And the most courageous thing we can do is to allow ourselves to keep learning, listening, and choosing understanding over judgment. Because in the end, the measure of a life well lived is not in how right we were, but in how willing we were to grow.